Before Salem, before the Inquisition, before the church even spoke of witches, there was another story, buried for centuries, reaching back to creation itself. But what if everything you knew about witchcraft was wrong? This isn't cauldrons in forests or moonlit dances. It's far older, far more dangerous, a tale of angels who fell, daughters born with rebellion in their blood, and women whose power made heaven itself tremble. Tonight we uncover the truth of the first witch, born not of earth but of angelic fire and cosmic defiance. Long before medieval Europe trembled at the mention of witchcraft, ancient civilizations whispered of something that moved through the darkness with predatory grace. In the candlelit temples of Mesopotamia, scribes carved frantic warnings about creatures that weren't quite demon, weren't quite divine. They called them Lilith, winged spirits of the night who seduced men's souls and devoured children's dreams. However, here's what sends chills down the spine. These weren't mere monsters conjured by primitive minds. These were the original templates, the cosmic blueprints for what would later be called witchcraft. The Babylonians spoke in hushed, terrified whispers of Lamashtu, daughter of the sky god Anu, who had been cast out of heaven for daring to challenge divine authority. Does this sound familiar? She wasn't the typical demon. She was divine royalty turned rogue, carrying powers that could unravel reality itself. When she descended to earth, trailing starlight and fury, she brought forbidden knowledge that mortals were never meant to possess. Seduction became a weapon sharper than any blade. Darkness became an ally more loyal than any friend. Death became a servant more obedient than any slave. Then came the Hebrew texts, and with them, names that would echo through millennia with the persistence of a curse that refuses to break. Lilith, not just Adam's rebellious first wife, but something that makes theologians nervous even today. She represents the archetype of the woman who looks authority in the eye and says no, who chooses exile over slavery, who transforms punishment into power. Nevertheless, what most don't realize is this. Lilith wasn't walking this path alone. The ancient texts whisper of another figure, one often overlooked but equally crucial, Naamah, sister of Tubal-Cain, whose very name means pleasant, but whose legacy drips with darkness. Jewish mystical traditions paint her as a figure of seduction and sorcery, a woman who taught forbidden songs that could bend reality with the malleability of heated metal. Where Lilith represented open rebellion, Naamah embodied subtle corruption, the whisper that plants seeds of doubt. The knowledge passed in shadows, the power that spreads through willing hearts with the intensity of wildfire consuming dry grass. These weren't village sorceresses grinding herbs by candlelight, muttering over bubbling cauldrons in forest clearings. These were cosmic archetypes of rebellion, divine beings who had chosen to turn their backs on heaven's rigid hierarchy. They became the first witches, not because they practiced magic, but because they embodied the very essence of what witchcraft would become: the refusal to accept powerlessness, the embrace of forbidden knowledge, the alchemical transformation of exile into strength. But Mesopotamia and Israel weren't alone in whispering about women who wielded dangerous power. In Greece, the goddess Hecate reigned over night, crossroads, and witchcraft, often depicted holding torches to light paths into forbidden realms. Unlike Lilith, she wasn't cast as evil. She was a guide, a patron of those who dared to walk between worlds. In Egypt, Isis was revered as a mistress of magic, whose spells resurrected Osiris and defied death itself. Her worship would later terrify early Christians because she prefigured the Virgin Mary, yet with powers far greater. In the north, the Norse spoke of Freya, master of cider magic, weaving fate itself, feared and respected in equal measure. Across civilizations, the pattern is unmistakable. Witches and goddesses were never just villains. They were priestesses, healers, and guardians of secret knowledge. This raises a chilling question: were all these myths independent inventions, or fragmented memories of the same forbidden lineage, retold in different cultures? If Lilith and Naamah were born of divine rebellion, then perhaps Hecate, Isis, and Freya weren't separate goddesses at all, but echoes of the same archetype, the first witch, multiplied across the world. The Book of Enoch tells a story that makes the church's skin crawl even today. It speaks of the Watchers, angels sent to observe humanity, who instead chose to descend and take human wives. But what if this wasn't simple divine lust? What if this was the moment when heaven's most guarded secrets were deliberately leaked to earth, when cosmic knowledge was passed down through bloodlines rather than divine revelation? These angelic unions produced the Nephilim, giants who terrorized the earth with their corrupted power. Nevertheless, here's the part that keeps scholars awake at night. The women who bore these children weren't passive victims. According to Jewish mystical traditions found in texts such as the Zohar, these mortal mothers became something else entirely, carriers of angelic knowledge, living conduits through which forbidden arts could flow into human consciousness with the stealth of poison seeping into a well. Nama emerges again in these traditions, not merely as Tubal-Cain's sister, but as something that makes angels themselves tremble. She becomes associated with Samael, the great adversary, the angel who refused to bow before Adam. In Kabbalistic texts, Nama is described as one who taught humans the art of enchantment, who showed them how to weave spells from starlight and shadow, and how to make reality dance to their will. But here's the terrifying truth. She wasn't learning these arts. She was their original source, their divine wellspring. Lilith, too, finds her place in this cosmic drama that plays out beyond mortal comprehension. Cast out from Eden, she doesn't simply become a demon lurking in nightmares. She becomes Samael's consort, the queen of the night spirits, the mother of a demonic progeny that carries both angelic power and rebellious fire in their veins. Together, Lilith and Samael create a lineage that runs parallel to human civilization, a bloodline that carries within it the memory of heaven and the defiance that led to their spectacular fall. Can you see where the true origin of witchcraft lies? Not in human curiosity about herbs and healing, but in divine knowledge passed down through generations of women who carried angelic blood with the secrecy of a hidden treasure in their DNA. These weren't human practitioners stumbling toward magic in the dark. These were the daughters of fallen angels, inheriting powers that had once moved through the golden courts of heaven itself. Ancient mythologies across the world preserve disturbing parallels. In Greece, tales of the Danaids, 50 daughters bound to cursed marriages, echo the Watchers' unions, suggesting women transformed into vessels of divine rebellion. In Mesopotamia, Inanna's descent into the underworld reads less like a goddess's journey and more like an encoded tale of forbidden unions producing chaos on Earth. Even Celtic lore speaks of the Sedir, otherworldly women of strange beauty who ensnared men and bore children not entirely human. Across every culture, the same story repeats, unions between mortals and something other, producing a legacy both feared and worshipped. Could witchcraft itself be less about rituals and spells and more about inheritance? A bloodline seeded by the Watchers, manifesting in subtle ways across generations? Some women remembered for their insight, their healing, or their terrifying curses may not have been learning magic at all, but awakening something already inside them. This perspective reframes witchcraft as less of a human invention and more of a divine infection, spreading quietly through families, villages, and entire civilizations. If you're finding these connections as mind-blowing as we are, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started and the rabbit hole goes much deeper than expected. By the time Christianity had spread across Europe with the persistence of spilled ink on parchment, these ancient stories had become something far more dangerous than myth. They had become evidence, living proof that rebellion against divine order wasn't just possible, but that it walked among them in flesh and blood. The church faced a terrifying possibility that kept bishops awake in cold sweats. What if there really were women among them who carried the literal bloodline of fallen angels? The medieval church's response was both brilliant and brutal, with the precision of a surgeon's knife dipped in holy water. They took these ancient archetypes, Lilith, Nama, and Lamashtu, and performed the ultimate rebrand, transforming them into something they could hunt: the witch. But this wasn't simple demonization. This was strategic mythology designed to transform cosmic rebels into earthly criminals. to reduce angelic daughters into human heretics who could be burned. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, reads with the chilling precision of a manual for identifying the descendants of fallen angels walking among mortals. Its authors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, weren't just describing practitioners of folk magic, brewing love potions in cottage kitchens. They were creating a profile based on ancient terrors. Women who seduced men with supernatural allure, who wielded power over life and death, who moved through darkness as easily as light, who refused to submit to masculine authority. Sound familiar? These were the exact characteristics that had defined Lilith and Nama thousands of years earlier. But what was the Church's greatest fear? It wasn't that women were learning witchcraft from dusty grimoires and midnight rituals. Their greatest fear was that witchcraft was teaching them that somewhere in the bloodlines of humanity, the genetic memory of angelic rebellion was stirring to life with the slow awakening of a serpent emerging from winter sleep. Every woman who spoke out of turn, every midwife who knew too much about birth and death, every widow who lived alone without male protection became a potential carrier of this cosmic defiance. The witch hunts weren't just about religious orthodoxy or social control. They were about evolutionary warfare, a desperate attempt to purge from humanity any trace of its angelic inheritance before it could fully awaken. The Church understood something that modern scholars often miss. The women they burned weren't just practicing forbidden arts, they were embodying a forbidden possibility that threatened the very foundations of divine order. This is why the trials often obsessed over sexuality and childbirth. Midwives and healers were not merely accused of medical malpractice. They were framed as gateways for Nephilim bloodlines to re-emerge. The Church saw every cradle as a potential throne for rebellion, every womb as a doorway through which angelic fire might return. Accusations of witches stealing infants or corrupting pregnancies weren't random hysteria. They were distorted echoes of ancient fears that fallen angel bloodlines were still moving through human veins. Even the imagery of the witches' Sabbath, women flying through the night, meeting demons beneath moonlight, engaging in forbidden unions, reflects a direct recycling of earlier myths about Lilith and her daughters. What terrified inquisitors most was not the rituals themselves, but what they represented. Women choosing alliances outside church authority, answering to powers older than Christianity itself. To the Church, this wasn't rebellion against society, it was rebellion against heaven. The story of the first witch is often told in whispers about cauldrons, curses, and midnight rituals. But what if we've misunderstood from the beginning? What if witchcraft wasn't superstition, but the survival of something far older, the last fragments of forbidden science carried through the daughters of the fallen angels? When we strip away the propaganda, what we call witchcraft looks suspiciously like ancient knowledge disguised as heresy. The herbs witches used for healing were early pharmacology. Their chants and incantations carried traces of sound-based rituals that modern physicists are only beginning to understand. Their stargazing wasn't mere fortune-telling, it was astronomy rooted in precise Babylonian charts capable of predicting eclipses centuries in advance. Think of Nama teaching songs that bent reality. What if those weren't just mystical hymns, but mathematical formulas, knowledge of sound, vibration, and frequency, wrapped in symbolic language to survive persecution? The Book of Enoch says the Watchers taught the cutting of roots and the knowledge of the stars. Today we'd call that botany and astrophysics. But to the Church, such knowledge was dangerous because it bypassed divine permission. The first witches weren't dabbling in fantasy. They were applying fragments of an advanced curriculum meant for angels, not mortals. Consider this: Babylonian star maps that rival modern astronomy. Egyptian papyri listing surgical procedures and contraceptives thousands of years before Europe rediscovered them. Ancient metallurgical knowledge that enabled the forging of weapons and tools considered impossible for their era. These weren't isolated breakthroughs. They were a pattern, a network of preserved knowledge handed down through women who carried the memory of the Watchers in their blood. This is why the Church feared witches, not because they stirred cauldrons under the moon, but because they represented the living survival of a rival tradition, one that taught salvation through knowledge, not obedience. Every herb gathered, every star tracked, every charm whispered was a challenge to the monopoly of divine revelation. Witchcraft wasn't merely rebellion. It was an underground science, encoded in ritual, protected by bloodline, and disguised as superstition to survive the flames of persecution. If the first witch was born of angelic fire, what did that mean for humanity's destiny? Ancient texts suggest their existence wasn't just a footnote in history, but a prophecy, a sign of something much larger unfolding across the ages. The Sibylline oracles, mysterious prophetic writings preserved in fragments, speak of women who carry hidden fire in their veins, chosen to reveal forbidden truths in times of crisis. They weren't outcasts, they were warnings. The presence of witches wasn't an accident, it was a signal that the boundaries between heaven and earth had been breached and that judgment was approaching. The Book of Revelation itself carries echoes of this terror. The Witch of Babylon, arrayed in purple and scarlet, wielding power over kings, drinking from a golden cup filled with abominations. Was this just a metaphor for empire, or was it the Church's deliberate attempt to demonize the archetype of the witch once again? The imagery fits too perfectly. A woman who cannot be controlled, who sits in defiance of heaven, who holds secret knowledge and corrupts the nations with it. For the early Church, this wasn't prophecy. It was paranoia crystallized into scripture. Medieval mystics whispered of cycles, ages where women of power would rise again, bringing knowledge, rebellion, and change, only to be hunted down by systems desperate to preserve control. Some even tied these cycles to celestial alignments, claiming that the daughters of the Watchers would reawaken when stars moved into forbidden patterns, when eclipses darkened the heavens, or when comets streaked across the sky. Could this be why witch hunts erupted with such violence whenever fear and upheaval swept across Europe? Not random superstition, but an unconscious recognition that the blood of the first witch was stirring again. Every burning pyre may have been less about punishing individual women and more about trying, and failing, to extinguish a prophecy written into the very fabric of creation. Even now, in the modern world, the archetype persists. Women reclaiming the identity of witch as empowerment, as rebellion, as a declaration that the old chains no longer bind them. Whether they know it or not, they're echoing the same fire that began when a fallen angel first whispered forbidden truths to mortal daughters. The prophecy is alive and it's unfolding right now. If this hidden connection between witches, prophecy, and apocalypse is opening your eyes, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next act uncovers revelations even darker than this one. If the Church burned witches to ashes, how can their story still be alive? Because fire destroys flesh, not blood. And whispers of certain bloodlines suggest that the descendants of fallen angels never truly vanished. In medieval Europe, families were rumored to carry the mark, not of the devil, but of something older, a trace of angelic ancestry hidden in their veins. Royal dynasties obsessed over intermarriage, believing they preserved divine right. But what if the true secret wasn't their claim to Davidic descent, but a much darker inheritance, fragments of Nephilim blood passed through generations? Occult traditions point to secret societies who believed exactly that. The Knights Templar were accused not only of heresy, but of worshipping a mysterious feminine figure who granted them visions and power. Some claimed she was Sophia, divine wisdom. Others whispered it was Lilith herself, disguised as the Black Madonna. Could it be that the Templars weren't worshipping idols, but protecting a bloodline, one that stretched back to the first witch? Even more disturbing are the rumors tied to the grimoires of the Renaissance. Many of these texts, the Key of Solomon, the Book of Abramelin, speak of invocations that only work for certain chosen vessels. Did sorcerers believe that true witchcraft required an inner spark that couldn't be taught, only inherited? That some blood carried a resonance with angelic fire, while others remained powerless imitators? The Church's obsession with rooting out entire families during witch trials starts to look less like superstition and more like targeted extermination. If even one woman escaped with the bloodline intact, the prophecy could continue. Maybe that's why whole villages were burned, why suspicion spread to daughters and granddaughters, why the shadow of witchcraft seemed impossible to eradicate. And here's the chilling question: what if the bloodline is still alive today? Not in fairy tales, not in fantasy novels, but pulsing in the veins of ordinary people who feel an unexplained pull toward the forbidden, who find themselves drawn to knowledge, to rebellion, to power they can't quite name. Could the resurgence of witchcraft in the modern world, from Wicca to occult revival, be less about reinvention and more about reawakening? The fire wasn't extinguished, it was hidden, waiting. And perhaps the prophecy of the first witch has been counting down to a moment we haven't reached yet. What if the first witch wasn't just a figure of the past, but a prophecy of the future? Ancient texts don't just describe Lilith and Nama as rebels, they describe them as harbingers. In Jewish mysticism, Lilith is not destroyed but preserved, bound only until the end of days, when she will walk the earth once more. The Zohar even whispers of her returning in the birth pangs of the Messiah, when chaos and order collide. But here's the chilling question: what if that prophecy is unfolding now? For centuries, societies have feared the return of the witch's bloodline. From the witch panics of Europe to the obsession with blood purity that drove inquisitions and purges. Were these frenzied hunts merely superstition or desperate attempts to stop something they believed was inevitable? Modern occultists still invoke Lilith as the Dark Mother, claiming that her exile wasn't punishment, but preservation. That she carries knowledge waiting for an age when humanity is finally ready to embrace it. Feminist mystics call her the hidden goddess of resistance. Some esoteric traditions go further, warning that when the daughters of the fallen rise again, they will bring back the forbidden arts of the Watchers, uniting bloodlines that were scattered after the flood. And here's where prophecy turns apocalyptic. Revelation speaks of a great harlot, a woman who rides the beast, intoxicates nations, and wages war against the saints. To the Church, she became Babylon. But to others, she is Lilith returned, the witch reborn at the end of time, bringing with her the forbidden power that heaven itself once tried to bury. Could it be that witchcraft is not merely humanity's shadow, but a countdown, a lineage stretching from heaven's rebellion to earth's final judgment? If so, then the first witch was not the end of the story. She was the beginning, the spark of a fire that even heaven could not extinguish. And if that fire is rising again, then the question is no longer who was the first witch, but who will be the last. The first witch may never have stirred a cauldron or cast spells in a moonlit forest. She was something far more dangerous, a woman who carried in her blood the fire of angelic rebellion and a will that even heaven could not tame. From Mesopotamian Lilith to Hebrew Lilith, from mystical Nama to medieval witch, the thread remains unbroken. The Church may have tried to transform angels into demons, but the truth endures. Somewhere in our DNA, the memory of paradise lost lives on, and with it, the power to reshape the world. But if the prophecy is true, then the story isn't finished. The witch was not only the first rebel, she was the sign of what was to come. Her exile wasn't her end, but her preservation, waiting for an age when humanity would be ready, or reckless enough, to embrace her fire once more. So the question that should haunt us isn't just who was the first witch. It's whether her bloodline, her legacy, her forbidden knowledge is rising again. But who was Lilith really? Beyond the myths and the whispers, beyond the Church's propaganda and ancient fears, what was the truth about the woman who dared to defy God himself? The answer will change everything you thought you knew about the first rebellion. Watch This Is Lilith to discover the shocking reality behind the name that still makes angels tremble. And if you're ready to uncover more forbidden histories the Church tried to erase, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because the next revelation might just be even darker.